Amira wiped the marble floor quietly, her eyes down, her back aching. The mansion always felt colder when Madame Kesa was home. With every step she took, her son Tay tried to follow, limping behind her with care. Never too close, always aware of the eyes that watched him with disgust. Tay had been born with a limp that made him walk unevenly, and a stutter that made every word feel like a battle. But he was kind. He remembered everyone's birthdays. He carved little wooden animals and left them on people's pillows, even if they never thanked him. Most didn't, especially Lulu, Madame Kesa's teenage daughter, who never missed a chance to make him feel like dirt. One morning, while Amira was sweeping the veranda, she heard laughter, cruel and sharp. She turned the corner to see Lulu holding one of Tay's handmade wooden birds, teasing. Did the cripple make this with his cursed little hands? And then she threw it to the ground and crushed it with her heel. Tay didn't cry. He simply knelt down and picked up the pieces. That evening, Madame Kesa announced that a royal guest would be arriving. Prince Ayo, heir to the throne and the face of every newspaper. Everything had to be perfect. Flowers were ordered, staff were warned, and Amira, she was told to keep the boy out of sight, not just out of the way, out of the building. During the celebration, music filled the room. Gold glass trays floated between guests, and Lulu wore a silk gown meant to catch the prince's eye. Amira watched from behind the curtains, her heart pounding for no clear reason. She couldn't find Tay anywhere. Panic pricked her skin. And then, the sound of luxury wheels outside. A silver royal car pulled up at the gate. The guards opened the door with precision. Prince Ayo stepped out, tall and sharp-eyed, with an expression that silenced the entire courtyard. He walked through the front door like he owned the air. Everyone stood straighter. But then, in the middle of the polished hallway, Prince Ayo stopped. His eyes landed on someone behind the crowd. Tay, barefoot, and holding a tray he wasn't supposed to carry, frozen mid-step. The prince's face changed. He stepped forward, fast, knelt down and wrapped his arms around the boy. Gasps rang across the room like shattered glass. "Where did you go?" the prince whispered. Then louder so everyone could hear. "That's my real brother." Madame Kesa's glass slipped from her hand. Lulu's mouth dropped open, and Amira, trembling behind the curtains, clutched her chest as the past returned in full force. Years ago, Amira walked the halls of the royal palace, not as a noblewoman, but as a kitchen maid. Her hands were always scented with ginger and smoke, her feet aching from long hours, but her spirit was light. There was someone who made it so. He was called Obasi. To the staff, he was just a palace guard. Strong, silent, respectful. But when no one was watching, he'd leave extra bread for Amira near the back ovens. He'd slip her jasmine flowers during her night shift. And in the quiet dark of the palace garden, they would speak of dreams. His of peace, hers of freedom. She didn't know he was more than just a guard. He didn't know their love would cost them everything. Obasi was the king's disowned brother, born of a different mother, hidden from public eyes, raised in the palace shadows. His existence was tolerated, but never embraced. He wore the guard's uniform not because he had to, but because it was the only way he was allowed to stay close to the palace. When Amira discovered she was carrying his child, she wept with joy. And then with fear. The moment the royal family found out, it was over. She was summoned to the court chambers. No trial, no hearing, just judgment. The king stood tall as he declared, "Erase her name. She never worked here. She never existed." Obasi was dragged out before he could defend her. His eyes found hers one last time before the gates closed behind her forever. Amira ran. Through the back forests, through villages where no one asked questions. She hid her belly with old shawls and prayed the child inside her would never know shame. She gave birth under the roof of an old healer who asked for nothing in return. Her son, Tay, entered the world with a quiet cry and a weak left leg. As he grew, his limp remained, and later, when he started speaking, his words stumbled. But his memory, sharp as fire, his laughter, rare but golden, his soul, kind beyond anything she had known. Amira raised him with lullabies and strength. She worked any job she could find. Finally, when Tay was old enough to walk without help, she found work in Madame Case's mansion in a distant province, a place far from royal eyes. Madame Case didn't know her name, her history, or her past. She only saw a quiet woman willing to work for little, with a child who stayed out of the way. That was all that mattered to her. Amira accepted it. For Tay's sake, for safety, for survival. She never spoke Abasi's name again. But sometimes, at night, when Tay was asleep and the wind was gentle, she'd hum the song Abasi wrote for her under the palace stars. The words didn't need to be spoken. They lived in her heartbeat, in the way she held her son close. She thought that chapter of her life had ended. She was wrong. Tay loved mornings the most, before the laughter began, before Madame Case's voice cracked through the halls, and before Lulu opened her eyes. In the quiet hours, he could follow his mother, helping in small ways. He'd carry buckets of water, drag cloths across the floor, or wipe the bottom of the banister where no one looked. His steps were uneven but determined. His stutter often made the other workers pause mid-task, unsure whether to respond or pretend they hadn't heard. The staff didn't mock him. They just looked at him with that same expression. Pity, softened with silence. But pity wasn't what hurt. It was what came next. Lulu, always dressed in silk, always accompanied by cousins who copied her cruel grins, saw Tay not as a child, but a target. Every time he entered a room, her smirk sharpened. "Look who's here," she'd call out. "The floor's about to collapse with all that limping." Her cousins giggled. They never tired of the joke, no matter how many times it bled. Tay tried to shrink himself. He'd lower his head, clutch the tray tighter, pretend he didn't hear. But he always heard. Everyone did. Sometimes he'd be asked to serve water during family luncheons. He'd shuffle carefully from one chair to the next, lips pressed shut, trying not to spill. But as soon as he got near Lulu, she'd jerk her glass away or kick her chair out, pretending it was an accident. Once, she knocked the tray from his hands and laughed when the glass broke. "What a clumsy little rat," she whispered, leaning close. "Even your mother's ashamed of you." That night, Tay didn't speak during dinner. Amira noticed he barely touched his ugali, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. The next morning, Tay spent hours in the shed behind the mansion. He carved silently, chipping and smoothing the soft bark he had gathered from the grove behind the servants' quarters. He shaped it carefully. Small wings, round belly, a beak curved upward. It was a bird, his mother's favourite animal. He sanded it until it gleamed with effort. Then, without telling anyone, he wrapped it in a torn blue ribbon and placed it gently on Lulu's windowsill. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to offer something she'd never had: kindness. Later that day, smoke rose from the garden fire pit. Tay stood frozen. In the pit lay the small wooden bird, blackened and split open. Lulu stood beside it, laughing. "You think gifts from gutter boys belong on my window?" she scoffed. "Keep your trash to yourself." Amira found her son curled behind the storage drums near the shed, clutching a piece of the bird's burned wing. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. She knelt beside him, pulled him close, and wiped the ash from his cheeks. "They can't see the gold in you," she whispered, But gold doesn't need their eyes to shine. You're made of more than they'll ever see. Tay didn't speak, but his fingers curled tightly around the burnt carving, and in that silence, something inside him began to burn. Not with hate, but with something deeper. A quiet strength, the kind that waits and remembers. The morning the letter arrived, the entire mansion shifted. Madame Kessa's heels clicked faster than usual across the tiled floor. Her voice, always sharp, now trembled with urgency. She waved the envelope like a royal decree as she gathered the staff in the main hallway. "Prince Ao is coming," she declared, her lips twitching into a rehearsed smile. "He'll be touring nearby villages to select one for royal development. Housing, roads, schools. He's agreed to dine here during his visit." Gasps fluttered among the servants. Even the head butler looked surprised. "This is our chance," Madame Kessa continued. "If he's impressed, the palace might invest in our land. That means more than reputation. It means power. So everything must be perfect. No mistakes." Her gaze swept the room like a blade. Then it landed on Tay, who stood quietly behind a mirror, holding a broom with both hands. Madame Kessa's eyes narrowed. "I don't want that boy seen anywhere. Understood?" Amira's chest tightened, but she bowed her head. "Yes, madam." "Tuck him in the storage room at the back. Keep him busy. If I hear a single stutter echoing through the walls while the prince is here..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Later that afternoon, workers buzzed like bees. Linens were aired, glass polished, rare wines retrieved. Lulu and her cousins tried on gowns and debated hairstyles, already imagining themselves smiling beside royalty in the village newsletter. In the servant quarters, Amira packed a small basket, a flask of water, 2 boiled plantains, and a folded scarf that smelled faintly of home. Tay sat on the edge of the bed, swinging his legs slowly. "I'm staying in the back room again?" he asked softly. Amira nodded, keeping her face calm. "Just for today. Just until the prince leaves." Tay didn't pout. He never did. Instead, he reached for her scarf, the old green one she wore on hard days, and held it to his cheek. It was his comfort, his quiet shield. "I'll stay quiet," he said. "Promise." Amira knelt before him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march up to Madame Kessa and remind her who she was, who Tay truly was. But instead, she whispered, "Thank you, my heart. Just for today." She led him through the hallway as guests began to arrive. Laughter echoed from the drawing room. Music started from the gramophone. Lulu's perfume thickened the air. At the end of the west corridor, Amira opened the storage room door. It smelled of lemon oil and old wood. A small stool sat in the corner, next to a shelf of folded linens. Tay walked in without hesitation. He took the basket and scarf, smiled at her, and said, "I'll be fine, Mama. You don't have to worry." Amira tried to smile back. She placed a kiss on his forehead and closed the door softly behind her. But as she turned and walked away, something stirred inside her, deep and fierce. Not fear, not sadness, but a storm that had waited for years. Because while Madame Kessa prepared for a prince, she had no idea that the boy in her storage room already carried royal blood. And no matter how deep you hide a flame, it still knows how to burn. The mansion sparkled like a jewel under the afternoon sun. Chandeliers were polished until they gleamed like stars. Golden runners lined the long dining table, set with imported cutlery and glittering crystal glasses. Staff moved in tight formation, their uniforms crisp, their eyes alert. Every corner of the estate held its breath. Then the gates opened. A silver car with royal insignia pulled in silently. The driver stepped out then opened the rear door with the precision of ritual. Prince Ao emerged, tall, regal, and wrapped in an embroidered navy tunic. He walked like someone used to people bowing. His eyes scanned the front steps, barely noticing the flower petals Madame Kessa had scattered in his honor. Madame Kessa approached with exaggerated grace. Lulu, beside her, was radiant in a golden gown, lips painted like rubies. She bowed low and gestured toward her daughter. "Your Highness, may I introduce Lulu, my pride, my light?" Prince Ao gave a polite nod, then looked away, his eyes restless. "Thank you," he said flatly. Lulu blinked. She extended her hand, but the prince had already turned. "I'd like a moment to stretch," he murmured. "It's been a long drive." Without waiting for permission, he veered away from the grand hall, past the garden doors, and into the hallway that led toward the kitchen. Madame Kessa froze. "The kitchen?" she whispered. "Why is he going that way?" No one had an answer. Prince Ao moved briskly, his steps quiet on the tiled floor. He wasn't sure what drew him there, maybe the smell of something familiar, maybe the memory of someone. But with each step, unease grew in his chest. Then he saw him. Tay, kneeling by the pantry door, was scrubbing the floor with a worn cloth. His body moved slowly, rhythmically, unaware of the eyes on him. A small basket rested nearby, and tied to the strap of his plain shirt was a thin necklace, barely visible unless you were looking. Prince Ao's breath caught. He had seen that necklace before, years ago. It was handcrafted leather, looped with an obsidian bead at its center, the exact one his uncle Obasi wore, a family relic passed from mother to son, a symbol no one outside the bloodline could possess. Tay looked up, startled by the sudden presence. He dropped the cloth, stood quickly, and stammered, "Sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" Ao took a step closer, eyes locked on the boy. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Tay." The prince stared. The cheekbones, the eyes, the way his lip curved downward just slightly when nervous. It was like looking into a mirror of someone he'd once known and lost. "Where's your mother?" Ao asked. In the be back, serving, sir." The prince looked again at the necklace. The room felt suddenly too quiet, too full of ghosts. He crouched down slowly, his voice softer than anyone had heard all day. "Did someone give you that necklace, Tay?" Tay nodded and pointed to the scarf folded on the stool. My mama said it was from my baba." The prince reached out, his hand hovering near the bead. His voice trembled. "Obasi gave you this?" Tay nodded again, unsure why the man's eyes looked like they might break. For a moment, the prince said nothing. He just stared. Then he stood up, straightened his back, and turned toward the main hall, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm had started, and it was heading straight for Madame Kessa's perfect little feast. The prince didn't return to the banquet right away. Instead, he slipped through the side corridor, where the kitchen heat faded and the scent of old soap clung to the air. His chest was tight. That face, that necklace, it couldn't be coincidence. It wasn't. He found her near the linen cabinets, straightening folded napkins with hands that had known far too much silence. When she turned and saw him, her breath caught. She hadn't seen that face in over a decade, but it was unmistakable. "Amira," he said. Not a question, a statement. She dropped the napkin. "My prince," she whispered, bowing. "Where did your son get that necklace?" The question landed like a hammer. Amira's eyes flicked to the hallway, then to the kitchen. She took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. "It was a gift from someone long gone." "I know that necklace," he said. "That design belongs to my family. Only one man outside my father's line ever wore it. My uncle Obasi. It was his mark, his only claim to blood. He wore it until the day he vanished. Amira's throat tightened. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the wall to steady herself. I'm asking again, Prince Io said, softer now. Is your son Obasi's? She closed her eyes. For years, she had buried the truth under broken routines and quiet sacrifice. Every night she tucked that necklace under Tay's shirt and kissed his head, swearing she'd never let the world hurt him again. She thought it was safest that way, for him and for herself. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tay is his son. Your uncle's son. My son. The air between them went still. She looked down, ashamed. I didn't mean for it to happen. We loved each other. But when the king found out, he erased me. I was cast out. No trial, no word to Obasi. I never saw him again. Prince Ao's face hardened. They told me he ran, that he shamed the bloodline. No, Amira said, her voice firmer now. He protected me. He was taken by your father's guards. I heard the screams. I tried to follow, but her voice cracked. They dragged him through the east gate. I never saw him again. Ao turned away for a moment, pressing his fingers to his temple. His jaw clenched. All his life, he had been told the story of a rogue uncle who disappeared for love of a servant girl, a shameful act, a betrayal of royal duty. But now, standing here, the truth cut deeper than any lie ever could. That makes Tay, he began, his voice quiet. My son, Amira said, placing a hand over her heart. But yes, your blood. Your kin Io turned to face her again, and for a moment she saw not a prince, but a young boy mourning the uncle he never truly knew. He stepped forward. That makes him my brother. Amira's eyes welled. Does he know? Io asked. Not the whole truth, only that his father loved him. I didn't want him to grow up chasing a family that turned its back on him. The prince nodded slowly. Then it's time they see what they turned their back on. He turned toward the hall, shoulders squared, voice steady. The feast was still going, but it was about to be interrupted, not by chaos but by truth. And truth, when it comes wearing a crown, is impossible to ignore. The great hall glittered with forced laughter and hollow compliments. Plates clinked, servants moved like shadows, and Madame Kaiser beamed as if the night had already been won. Lulu sat at the head of the table, her smile frozen into place, her eyes locked on the grand entrance, waiting for the prince to return and take his place beside her. But when the doors opened, what they saw was not what they expected. Prince Io stepped in with purpose, his face unreadable, his steps calm but commanding. And beside him was Tay. Tay walked slowly, limping as always, holding the prince's hand tightly. The same boy they had hidden, mocked, dismissed, now standing under the glow of crystal chandeliers with the future king beside him. The entire room froze. A fork clattered to the floor. Madame Kaiser stood abruptly, her voice sharp and desperate. Your Highness, what is the meaning of this? Ao didn't stop. She stepped forward, panic in her throat. That boy? He's no one. He's just the maid's crippled son. The words hung heavy in the air. Ao stopped in the center of the hall. Tay stood slightly behind him, his fingers trembling. The prince's voice, when it came, was calm but thunderous. This boy, he said, turning so all could hear, is more royal than any of you here. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He let the silence grow. He is the son of Obasi, my uncle, the man whose name was buried by those ashamed of his love. Tay carries his spirit, his courage, and though you tried to hide him in a storage room like a stain, he stands here now. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Madame Kaiser's face turned pale, her lips twitching with shock. Lulu shrank in her seat, her eyes wide, the colour draining from her face. Prince Ayo turned to face the guests, his tone unwavering. You laughed at his limp. You mimicked his stutter. You treated him as if his worth was measured by his walk or the shine of his shoes. But I see more nobility in his eyes than I have ever seen in this hall. The guests fell silent, their faces a mix of confusion, shame, and awe. Tay looked up at him, unsure, still gripping his hand. The prince knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, You don't need to speak like them, or walk like them to belong. You are already enough. Then he stood and faced the crowd once more. Let this be known, he said. I, Prince Ayo of the royal line, recognize Tay, son of Obasi, as my brother, and anyone who disrespects him, disrespects me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the palace advisors stood and bowed, followed by another and another, until half the hall had lowered their heads, not just to Ayo, but to the boy standing beside him. Tay's eyes welled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He stood taller, prouder, like he finally belonged to the world that had once turned its back on him. Madame Kesa clutched the tablecloth to keep herself steady, and Amira, standing just outside the door, finally allowed herself to exhale, because her son was no longer hidden. He had been seen, and he had been claimed. The mansion no longer echoed with Madame Kesa's voice. Instead, it whispered, with awe, with confusion, and in some corners, with shame. Servants passed hushed words in the corridors. Did you hear what the prince said? He called the maid's boy his brother. They bowed to him. To Tay. Madame Kesa hadn't been seen in days. Lulu barely stepped out of her room. The glittering perfection they'd built on pride now stood cracked, and the boy they'd tried to erase was now etched into every story told in the house. Amira moved through her work as always, her apron still neat, her hands still steady. But now, heads nodded in respect. Doors opened for her without command. The cook placed extra fruit in her basket without asking. Eyes softened when they looked at her son. Then came the letter, stamped with the royal seal and hand-delivered by a palace envoy. It invited Amira and Tay to the capital, not as servants, but as guests of honour. There would be a ceremony, the letter said, to restore what was taken and honour what was hidden. Amira read it once, then twice. Her fingers trembled, but her spine remained straight. She packed a single bag. Tay brought his carving tools and the scarf she had worn the day he was hidden. Now it was his banner. The palace had changed since Amira last walked its halls, but the wind still smelled of jasmine, and the throne room still gleamed with gold. At the ceremony, Tay stood beside Prince Ayo, wearing a robe stitched with the royal emblem and a sash bearing his new name. Tay Obasi, son of the lost lineage. There was no parade, no fireworks, but there was something purer, respect. When the king asked Amira what she wished for, she looked him in the eyes, unshaken by time. I don't want wealth, she said. I want a school, in our village, for children like Tay, for those who are mocked, forgotten, or left behind. They deserve more than survival. They deserve a future. The court grew still. Then the king, moved by the dignity in her voice, rose from his seat. It shall be done, he said. A school shall be built, in the name of Obasi's son, and the woman who raised him in silence and strength. The hall burst into applause. And in that moment, Amira didn't feel like a maid. She felt like a mother who had walked through fire and lit a torch for others. Tay reached for her hand. We did it, Mama, he whispered. But she smiled and shook her head softly. No, my son, You did. The sun dipped low over the red clay hills, casting golden light across the new school courtyard. Bamboo lanterns swung from ropes strung between trees, and children in colourful wraps chased one another through the soft grass. Laughter, pure and unfiltered, filled the air, but this time it wasn't followed by cruelty. It was celebration. At the front of the courtyard stood a tall stone archway. Chiselled into it were the words, Obasi Learning Centre for the ones they forgot. Villagers gathered in clusters, wide-eyed and dressed in their best. Elders who once looked down on Amira now stood in respectful silence. The staff from Madame Case's mansion came too, not out of obligation, but because they had witnessed a shift in the wind. At the centre of it all stood Tay, no longer hiding behind crates or curtains. He wore a simple robe of deep blue, the symbol of the royal crest embroidered by hand over his heart. And beside him stood Prince Ao, dressed humbly, smiling like a brother, not a ruler. Together, they stepped forward with a torch lit from the flame of the palace. Tay gripped the handle tightly. His limp was still there, but he walked with certainty now. They touched the torch to the ceremonial bowl, and a brilliant fire bloomed in the courtyard centre. The crowd erupted in cheers. As the celebration unfolded, a black car rolled to a stop at the edge of the school grounds. Madame Kessa stepped out slowly, her frame stiffer than usual. Behind her, Lulu hesitated, her expression unsure, her once perfect posture bent under the weight of regret. They approached quietly. Amira stood near the garden beds, arranging books into baskets for the new library. When she saw them, she paused, not with anger, but with clarity. Lulu opened her mouth. We didn't know. We didn't understand what we were doing. Madame Kessa added, We thought we were protecting our name. Amira held up her hand gently. You mocked what you didn't understand, she said. But names don't build legacies, hearts do. Let the future teach you grace. Neither woman replied. Amira turned back to her work. That evening, as music played and drums beat like thunder, Prince Ao sat beside his brother, watching the children dance in front of the firelight. Tay looked up and asked softly, Do you think Baba would be proud? Ao nodded, his eyes shining. He would be in awe. As the stars emerged one by one, the two brothers, one born of royalty, one raised in silence, stood shoulder to shoulder, not just as kin, but as symbols of change. And in the background, Amira hummed the song Obasi once sang to her in the palace garden, the melody now alive again in the soil, the air, and the beating hearts of children who finally had a place to learn. Final voice over, they laughed at his limp. But he walked into history with a prince by his side. In a world obsessed with appearances, it was his heart, not his legs, that stood tallest.